This is Sophaville's Dark Season presents The Dead Famous, Episode 5, with Ronald Moger as James Montague, Jonah Richert as the voice of the press, Hazel Young as Helen Beeston and Sister Anna Patrick, and Colin Rance as Geoffrey Montague. Jeremy's house was a mere hour or so away by train, and then a certain distance by foot. I called ahead of my visit to request seeing him under the guise of wishing to carry out an interview for the paper. My plan was then to request a photograph at the end as a personal favour. It would be a 6-mile trek from the station and no bus routes anywhere ran nearby. Rain was forecast for the week, and the idea of trudging along in sodden clothes did not enamour itself to me. Waterproofs were needed, and as soon as my workday ended, I headed up towards the high street in search of the needed apparel. I've always hated the banality and predictable uniformity of shopping areas. There was a time when chain stores and supranational businesses were but a future possibility, and you could rely on the small private businesses to supply your every need, albeit at a certain price. The prices are now lower, but at what cost? Well, if the smaller businessman isn't smart enough to move with the times or take the challenge of big business and throw it back at them, he more than deserves to lose his shop, and if that doesn't teach him his lesson, perhaps his home too. Just as I was beginning to contemplate violent suicide at the prospect of spending more time in this retail hell, a small camping shop caught my eye. Not because the name was unfamiliar to me, although that was a welcome element, but because of the poster in the window advertising the forthcoming sale that read simply, "Now is the winter of our discount tents." I appreciated the wordplay of this and thought that the shop surely deserved my business just because of this sign alone, and went in to browse their outdoor weather department. A voice asked if they could help me, which I immediately recognised as Louise. After expressing surprise at her being there, she explained that she had been forced to take a second job to cover the financial mess that her beau had left behind. The shop had been kind enough to fit her hours around her other job at the paper, and she filled in a few hours here and there to cover those members of staff with children to collect from school or families to feed. I never wanted to know my colleagues very well, but for some reason Louise's quiet determination to get on with life, coupled with her very apparent skill with words, endeared her to me. Seeing her in a new light, as she pleasantly helped me with the purchase of some waterproof clothing, we acknowledged that we should talk more on a non-work basis, and then organised to go out for a quiet drink, the time of which I delayed until the following week. The next few days would be busy. I had work to do. The interview was to take place under the pretense of an article concentrating on the retired community of actors and filmmakers in the UK, how they had settled into their new lifestyles, what their day-to-day existences consisted of, and so on. I had promised it would be very general, not at all personally intrusive, and, along with assuring him of my long experience in the field, I think this is what had convinced him to take part, despite his having shied away from publicity for all these past years. The walk to his house from the station was typical of so many in the English countryside. It's as if they started out in 1961 with bold and honest enough intentions to create decent pathways and roads for all. The projects had then managed to pave just outside of the conurbation to the first pub, stopped there for a pint or 7, and then forgotten what exactly they'd been sent there to do in the first place. This explains two things. Firstly, why all roads and pathways stopped approximately 3/4 of a mile outside of practically every village in England, and secondly, why they were able to build so many ugly buildings in the following 10 years, as I presume this is what became of the leftover road building materials. These construction companies, it seemed, were not the sharpest architectural tools in the box. I trudged my way along lane after country lane, narrowly avoiding certain death with a number of farming vehicles, before finally getting to Jeremy's house. The man couldn't have been more charming. He answered the door with a smile and a handshake. The rain I had prepared for had not come, and I stood there quite incorrectly dressed for the occasion. Jeremy said he was enjoying a light lunch in his conservatory, and that perhaps it would be the best place to conduct the interview. I gladly accepted. I was honoured to be in his company. It was a delightful day with sunshine and a light breeze. The standard birds could be heard singing in the distance as a soundtrack to the conversation. The interview was easy and flowed naturally for me. I drifted the subject to ask about the more celebrated part of his life, what it had been like working with these people, the stars, the wonderful entertainers. He gave such limited and short answers to these questions, and towards the end of it, I did realise he was becoming somewhat tired, eventually resulting in him appearing to almost physically become irritated at my later inquiries. I considered this a good opportunity to end the interview and to request the photograph which had, of course, been my whole point of the journey in the first place. He informed me that he didn't pose for photographs anymore, and it would be more than alright to use a stock picture for reference. I tried to convince him to have the picture taken, but he would not listen. He became more agitated, assured me that he had been more than hospitable and that perhaps it was time for me to leave in case my insistence ruined what had been, up until that point, a pleasant day. The fear returned. The familiar cold sweat. My goal was slipping away again. I grabbed his wrist and told him the picture had to be taken, that perhaps he didn't understand. He panicked and shrieked for me to let go of him as he wrestled from my grip and started down the hall and towards the stairs to get away from me. You have to understand, I had to get that photograph. I caught up with him on the stairs and tried to clarify things. I suppose with hindsight now it was with too much force in my voice. I went to grab him one more time, but after the lightest touch from myself, he lost his footing, and then his balance. He teetered for a split second before falling backwards towards me. I found myself slamming against the wall as he tumbled past me and down stair after backbreaking stair until he slammed abruptly onto the hall floor. I froze, almost panting as I struggled for breath over my now growing terror. Jeremy lay motionless, apparently void of life. His head was twisted at a grotesque angle, and his face, I saw as I dared to venture nearer, was hideously staring forwards, open-eyed, emotionless. This might perhaps have looked bad to anyone else who might not understand. I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. No one must know I was there. Having cleaned all items I had used at lunch, I left his there as if he had eaten alone. The cups and plates I checked for fingerprints or smudges, the crumbs were swept away. Once I was sure that all evidence of my visit was gone, I returned to Jeremy for my photograph. Lifting his body up, I noticed his neck had a dark blue mark where it had been snapped. I pulled the collar of his shirt up to hide this and, smiling, took the picture I had worked so hard to get. I took 3 pictures in case I looked strange in one by blinking, and then I left the house. Jeremy, I left on the hallway floor to be discovered, as it turned out, a few days later by concerned neighbours. The police and the coroner presumed, as I hoped they would, that he had fallen accidentally, an open and shut case. He was buried the following week. I didn't feel the need to attend his funeral.
Dearest son, I was delighted to get your letter after all these months away. I understand that your studies must take up a great deal of your time, so you don't need to worry yourself about writing too often. As long as I know you're doing well and are safe, my mind is at ease. The house is very quiet without you. When you were young, you were always glued to the television. I really worried about your eyes, you know. Mrs. Jennings from the bookshop on the high street dropped by with an order of yours, which was really kind of her as she knew my knee was playing up again. I think it was Who's Who, but I need to check. I'll pack it into a parcel for you so that you should get it next week. I've also packed in a few bits and pieces to keep you going. You'll see when it arrives. If there's anything else you're short of, just let me know and I'll send it along when I can. It's a shame that you can't make it home for Christmas, but I do understand. They're doing a meal at the social club, so I might go along to that. Harry and Betty should be there, so it'll be good to see them. I've kept your room hoovered, so it'll be nice and clean for you when you get back. It'll be good to have you home. They're advertising for staff at the paper on the high street. Maybe you could get your foot in the door, if they have an apprenticeship going. Keep it in mind, at least. Keep safe, son. I've enclosed another cheque for you. Don't go spending it all at once. Ever, your loving father.
A police spokesman has said that, despite rumours that a breakthrough is imminent, they still ask the public to be vigilant and that any witnesses to the cemetery disturbances can come forward without fear of being treated as suspects.
The photographs I took at work, and also those for my private collection, were always looked after, but at varying levels of care and presentation depending on the personal attachment I had to them. After my father had moved out, I bought the family house from him. I cleared out his possessions to either be sent along to him or simply left outside for the next day's refuse collection. I set to work renovating his room. Over time, the pictures filled box after box. 2 walls were taken with shelving for the display and storage of my work. The lower rows I installed held the chronologically organised negatives, placed into protective envelopes to avoid deterioration, and then boxes to avoid any sunlight that might seep through the cracks in the curtains. The higher shelves held my portfolio of prints and all of my published work, including the articles I had written alongside them. All were presented in folder after dust-free folder, the final shelf above those taken by carefully chosen frame pieces that I had found myself being particularly proud of. One wall was put aside for my private work, the spaces for the 30 faces, all in the order presented in the supplement itself. I'd marked out spots for each frame, equidistantly, in pencil on the wallpaper itself. After I had achieved my second picture, I mentally drew up an image of how the display might eventually look and, using what spare money I'd put aside that month for utility bills, instead went straight to Boots the Chemist's to buy 30 photograph frames of exactly the same and correct dimensions. As you may recall, the early years in building my collection had been lean, and the empty wall had looked strange after a period of no additional photographs, and so, as a motivation, I'd numbered the inside of each frame in turn and placed them in their individually assigned spots. This image served as a constant nagging reminder as to my growing purpose. Each morning, before work, I would walk past the open door as I made my way to the bathroom, only to catch an accidental glance at this barren wilderness that should have been in full bloom, with all the gazes and smiles of all those wondrous stars gleaming out back at me. Instead, it would reward me with nothing more than an image of fading wallpaper and empty dreams. When at work, my colleagues seemed to find constant amusement in accusing me of having a case of the Mondays, no matter what day it was. Little did they know what disappointment bored away at my soul, a pain only made worse by the moronic humour of my hyena-like co-workers with their comparable looks to match their smiles. The incident at Jeremy Cove's house had been an unfortunate turn of events. Yes, I had a new photograph for my collection, and yes, my tracks had been covered. But since returning, I had been completely off my tea. My stomach acid levels seemed to have shot up somewhat, and only a change of diet seemed to calm this. I put the stomach problem down to whatever had been in the sandwiches Jeremy had served me, took to keeping some antacid tablets with me, and tried to get on with things as best I could. The week passed quietly, and, by a stroke of luck, the police had indeed been back to the office to interview me the previous Friday. Alas, I had been out visiting my previously mentioned friend in the country. As there had been no major developments, and little evidence of robbery or major acts of vandalism concerning the graves, the police were not receiving the support from headquarters towards their investigations they had hoped for. An additional inconvenience to them was being constantly reassigned to other cases involving actual living people. My heart went out to them. By the time the next weekend came along, I was ready to analyse my next steps towards project completion. The unfortunate incident with Jeremy had given me a sense of increased caution. Although I had not been connected to that, or any other incident to my knowledge, I felt it prudent to change tack and go back to the more traditional forms of photograph hunting more associated with the modern paparazzo. Mr. Terence Ditton, number 11 on the list, was still going strong as an actor and was admired both at home and abroad. He had been in demand as a character actor in Hollywood, but due to his advancing years had been spending more and more time in the UK, much to my pleasure. A film of his was about to premiere in the West End, and, after securing my photographer's pass and ticket for the evening with a mind to review the film itself in the newspaper, here was a nice, simple opportunity to get an additional photograph. I took my place with the throng of other journalists at the red carpet as the stars walked about, posed, and made their way into the cinema. Once inside, I showed my ticket for entrance to the film and was lucky enough to see Mr. Ditton before I went through to the auditorium. He was the most charming of characters, much like the gentlemanly characters he constantly portrayed on screen. He graciously posed for a photo with me, and even signed my cinema ticket and shook my hand before taking his leave. He was a true star, and the experience reminded me of how fickle his modern replacements were in their cavalier attitudes towards the press and their fans. If only the other stars had been this accommodating to my hobby, then perhaps things wouldn't have been so complicated and taken the turn that they had. As I settled down to watch the film in the auditorium, I had newfound delight. I was 8 years old again. watching Crackerjack at the BBC with my father, surrounded by the excited audience and the lights and the cameras and the sheer joy of it all. Everything was so perfect. If only it could have lasted. On my return to work the following Monday, the mood in the office was sour. The editor had called for a meeting for later that morning. Rumours were rife that the paper wasn't doing as well as it had in previous months. Circulation was down, along with advertising revenues. People were nervous. Listening to gossip was the furthest thought from my mind. I never understood why people wanted to whisper and speculate about things when they could just either ask the person directly and stop any false rumours, or if they were not in a position to ask the person, just wait until the news came out. Better still, they could just get on with their lives and forget it. The problem with the people in my office, of course, was that they really had no lives to speak of, and therefore gossip bred and developed like some scurrilous plague. Louise came to my room and asked me if I knew anything about the rumours, and I gladly told her I did not, and was not about to make any judgments until the editor himself had spoken. She responded with silence, but I knew she wanted more of an answer. Even if it had turned out to be false, the weaker type of person needs that. As the investigative journalists similarly request bones to chew on from politicians and policemen when chasing a story, so do the gossip mongers need that tidbit of information to feed their minds on, lest they chew right through their jawbones and take their own heads clean off with worry. When the meeting finally did take place, its subject matter was not much of a surprise. Paper had indeed been doing badly, and the future prospects were not good. We were being beaten out and off the market by free papers handed out at railway stations, and also the bigger companies with more developed and loyal readership. The paper had decided to join the free paper market, and that meant two things. Firstly, that a lot of the stories would be sourced from news agencies instead, and so some of our staff would not be needed. And secondly, that the staff who were to stay would only be the best of the best, so that an identity for the paper could be formed to build a position for itself in this new arena. We were thanked for our time and sent back to work. This was bad. My hours had already been cut, and now they were thinking of making more general reductions. I needed to have a plan, and fast. The market had changed so much in these past years. Paparazzi and internet reviewers were slowly becoming favourites of the entertainment court. There was no way I could hope to compete as a lone operator. If our paper was failing, no doubt others were too. The cutting hours had seemed a curse at the time, but had become a blessing, as it had given me more time to concentrate on my project, but losing my hours completely would not be convenient in the slightest. I was due to finish at 2 p.m. that day, so after submitting my review of the Terence Ditton film, I took my coat to make my way home, but was stopped by Louise again before leaving. She shyly reminded me that we had partly arranged to go for a drink, and that I hadn't mentioned it, so I thought I was busy, but wondered if I might be free that day. The camping shop had no shifts for her that afternoon, and she had a spare few hours. I can always think of things to occupy myself. My part of London has a myriad of bookshops, libraries and galleries to catch my eye for a while, and even at home I never tire of watching the same films over and over again, lip-syncing the words I knew so well as if they were my own. Cursed the slowness of my brain that day, that I couldn't at that time think of any of these distractions to excuse myself from Louise's company. She was of course the least idiotic of my colleagues, but I still had work to do elsewhere. We agreed to meet an hour later at the Lamb & Flag near the office, but most importantly for me, next to the bus stop where I could travel directly home afterwards and avoid any social responsibilities of walking anyone home. The meeting was as I had predicted. It had started badly with me accidentally knocking into a medicine ball-headed oaf at the bar who had tried to use it as an excuse to batter my head into a pancake. A few words to escape from the situation, and then I sat down to hear Louise drone on and on about her lost boyfriend for the better part of an hour. She didn't seem to notice that I spent most of the evening looking at the edge of my glass or studying the various pieces of dirt under my fingernails. Eventually she seemed to ask me a question to which I gave a knee-jerk answer based on the tone of her voice. It seemed to have been the correct response as she thanked me for my understanding, and then continued talking. Just when I thought the evening couldn't get any more painful, Barry walked in through the pub door with what I presumed to be an escort girl in tow. The company that Barry kept made it difficult to tell whether he really had hired a lady of the night, which he bragged about doing from time to time, or if he had just met a normal run-of-the-mill gutter-side tramp of a girl. Either way, I'm sure Barry didn't care, and I certainly didn't. For some reason, Louise seemed happy to see him as he wobbled over to our table, drunk as he was, or with a walk that would suggest he had a fish trying to worm its way out of his rectum. His breath was positively flammable with spirits, and I regretted that not only did I not smoke and therefore had no cigarette to offer him, but I did not even have a lighter to strike up and cast towards him. I hoped either would cause him to combust, but alas, the image remained a simple pleasure in my head. Barry asked me what I was smiling about, and then why Louise was hanging around with such a person as myself. She interjected to respond that I had been quite the gentleman. In my experience, it takes very little to convince a modern female of your gentlemanly status. In years gone by, it would have required the proper attire, random acts of dashing daring-do, possibly while holding a handkerchief and putting down some young ruffian, or kissing a lady's hand and complimenting her attire and manner. These days, one only had to remember not to release bodily air in her presence and by the first drink of the evening, and suddenly you're ranked up with Valentino himself. Despite his obvious hatred of me, Barry decided to leave his escorts at the bar and join us at our table. Louise now seemed to not only enjoy his company, inebriated as it was, but also laughed at his lewd advances, as if they were humorous rather than the lecherous lunges that they obviously were. It seemed like a good time to exit. I made my excuses and left the pub. As I walked past the window, I saw Barry and Louise laughing together, and, in the alleyway to the sides of the pub, Barry's escort friend was pleasuring the previous medicine ball man from earlier in the evening. There really was someone for everyone. Next week, the police close in on James, and his colleagues step up their investigations. How does a rat react when backed into a corner? Find out next week. New episodes are released to all streaming services every Wednesday. Subscribe now to get notified on its release. All music is by Shane Ivers of Silverman Sound. The Dead Famous was written and produced by Ronald Moger. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at This Is Sofaville.